This is True Crime Out Loud.
I'm your host, B.
And I'm your host, Jen.
And this week's case is kind of our Halloween special. And we're going to talk a little bit about the origins of Halloween. Halloween began with the ancient Celts over 2,000 years ago. And the tradition that everybody thinks of when they think of Halloween is trick-or-treating. And that's obviously a much more recent invention. And it began in the U.S. somewhere in the mid-1920s to 30s. And that kind of led to the transformation of Halloween from a religious and superstitious type festival to almost like a holiday for kids. It did lose some popularity during war times due to the sugar shortage and sugar rations that affected candy production, but the baby boom of the 1950s gave new life to the tradition of trick-or-treating. According to USA Today, for Halloween 2021, that is, if we can get all of our shipping containers in, that's causing a lot of problems. I've heard that even affects Halloween candy. But the expected expenditure on Halloween candy will surpass $10 billion, making it a record number on the Halloween expenditures. And of that, there's like $3.32 billion on costumes and another $3.17 billion on decorations and a whopping $3 billion on candy alone. One part of the trick-or-treating tradition that I'm sure everybody heard, I know I heard it when I was a kid, and we've all told our kids this, and it's kind of almost become trick-or-treating tradition and lore passed on many, many, many years, is really more of an urban legend than a fact. And this is the notion that poisoned candy or razor blades or sharp objects and apples. I mean, I know everyone's parents told them, hey, be careful what you get. Don't eat anything open. People could put razor blades in apple. Don't go to that house. It's sketch looking. You might get some candy that, is tainted or whatever. And that kind of gave birth to this notion that happens. And a bunch of unsuspecting young people every year were munching down on razor blades and poison candy. A wide study done on tainted candy of Halloween showed that these reported cases were mostly exaggerated, and there was no actual evidence that anyone had killed or harmed a child in this manner. That was until Halloween of 1974. And that's going to take us to our case that we're covering this week. And it's over two locations, Pasadena, Texas, and Deer Park, Texas. Now, Pasadena is part of the Houston metro area and has a population of 149,000. At the time of our case, 1974, the population was closer to about 90,000. It's located in Harris County and is named after the city in California of the same name, Pasadena, California. Pasadena also has the largest all-volunteer fire department in the U.S., which I thought was a real interesting fact. I mean, that's incredible. That is a huge town to have a volunteer fire department. Our other location is Deer Park, Texas, which is located about 12 minutes by car from Pasadena. It's also in Harris County and part of the Houston metro area, and it's a lot smaller, has a population of about 32,000, and in 1974, looking at about 13,000 people. And of those 13,000 people living in Deer Park was the O'Brien family. Ronald O'Brien, 30 years old, his wife Deneen, and their two children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth.
So this case began on Thursday, October 31st, 1974, Halloween. And the O'Brien family had been out trick-or-treating. They returned to their home that evening. The kids had been filling their faces with their newly collected Halloween candy, and it was time for bed. Ronald told both of his kids that they could have one more piece of candy before bedtime. So 5-year-old Elizabeth chose her candy, and 8-year-old Timothy chose his candy, a large pixie stick. And pixie sticks are paper straws filled with powdered candy that a child pours directly into their mouth. And you probably have seen these. Timothy took his first big taste of the candy and said it was bitter, so Ronald gave him some Kool-Aid to wash this awful taste out of his mouth. Timothy almost immediately began vomiting, and shortly after, he began having convulsions. So Ronald, scared to death for his child, he calls for an ambulance, and they transport 8-year-old Timothy to the local hospital. However, it was too late for Timothy. He died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. So the hospital notifies the police, and Detective Bill Lanier responded to the hospital where Timothy's lifeless body was held. Detective Lanier began to interview the family to determine what in the world could have happened to this young child on Halloween. They get a statement from his father, Ronald O'Brien. He tells them that that evening his family had dinner at the home of Jim Bates, his wife, and their 2 kids in Pasadena, Texas. After dinner, it was rainy, so Ronald and Jim agreed the 2 dads would take the children trick-or-treating in the Bates neighborhood. One of the Bates children stayed home, so it was Ronald, his 2 children, Elizabeth and Timothy, Jim Bates, and one of his children. So the 2 dads and the 3 kids set out to go to several homes. They did go to one house where no one was home, so the kids ran ahead to another home. Well, Ronald was lagging behind, and he caught up to the group after someone came to the door at that what they thought was a home with no one there, and somebody handed him 5 giant 22-inch pixie sticks. So he gave one to each of the 3 children and said, "Hey, a rich neighbor's handing out expensive candy." And they continued trick-or-treating. The O'Brien family then returned to their home in Deer Park, where the last thing Timothy had to eat was part of that giant pixie stick. Ronald said Timothy began crying, "Daddy, Daddy," then said his stomach hurt and bent over vomiting. Ronald said he was holding his son in his arms as he vomited, and then he just went limp. He said he thought they were so careful with Halloween candy and checking the things. Well, they interviewed Danine, the wife of Ronald and mother of Timothy, and her statement lined up with what Ronald told them. So they interviewed Jim Bates, the friend whose home they had been at, and his statement also was in line with what Ronald said.
What a horrible tragedy on what is normally a fun holiday for kids that everybody looks forward to. And now the police are left investigating this crime. And the first thing they're going to do from an evidence collection standpoint is nail down where those pixie sticks are. They retrieve the one partially consumed by Timothy, and they get the other 4 that Ronald originally had. One of the pixie sticks was given to 5-year-old Elizabeth, 2 were given to other Bates children, and 1 had been given to an unrelated child. The 5th child had wanted to eat the candy but was unable to get it open, so the child went to sleep in the bed with the pixie stick in their hand. None of the children had consumed any of the powder from the pixie sticks except for Timothy. They do lab tests on the candy and discover that the top 2 inches of each stick had been replaced with cyanide powder, and then the straw itself was stapled shut. There was enough cyanide in that 2 inches of the top of that stick to kill several adult men. Is this something that happened at the Pixie Stick factory? Is this something that happened in a store? Well, Pixie Sticks have been around since the 1950s and have been a Halloween tradition. And as Jen said, it is a paper straw filled with powdered candy. Normally, they are about like 4 or 5 inches long, so a 22-inch one is a big boy. They were very popular in the 50s, but gave way to my favorite candy of all time, Sweet Tarts, which is basically a pixie stick in a solid form. And I, to this day, eat Sweet Tarts like a maniac. Pixie Sticks are still available. They were picked up by Nestle's Wonka brand candy line, who produces them to this day. And the giant 22-inch Pixie Sticks are the most prized because Some are half the size of others, and a standard regular old, you get them on paper, you get them on Halloween, paper pixie stick is about 5 inches long. So the police perform an autopsy on Timothy, and it's no surprise that they find that he died from ingesting cyanide. He was heavily dosed with it, and in fact, he had consumed enough cyanide to kill 3 adult men. Timothy died less than an hour after consuming the powder. So obviously the police are going to want to know who gave this poison candy to Timothy and the other children, and they need Ronald's help to do this because he's the one that gave the candy to the kids after this neighbor handing out expensive candy gave them to him. Ronald has a hard time telling police which house. They were in the Bates' neighborhood and not Ronald's neighborhood, and so he was a little confused about where he was. He was disoriented, kind of turned around. They try to narrow down which street Ronald was on, and even then he has a hard time deciding and narrowing that down. So the police take Ronald and they begin to walk through the neighborhood to kind of see if this would jog his memory, in an effort to retrace his steps to locate the house. It took a few days of attempting this, but finally Ronald remembers where he got the pixie sticks, and he's able to point that house out to detectives. And he tells them that he did not see the face of the person, but just an arm sticking out the cracked door. And he knew it was a man's arm because it was hairy like a man's arm. Well, now the police has narrowed down their suspect list considerably. Ronald has identified the house where the pixie sticks came from. And the police learn that the home is owned by a man named Courtney Melvin. And the police bring Melvin in for questioning. Melvin denies knowing anything about the poison candy and outright refutes that it came from his home. In fact, he tells police that he was not home that evening. He was at work and didn't arrive home until 11 p.m. He said his wife and kids were home and they turned out the lights early because they ran out of candy. Another Halloween tradition, right? We only go to the houses that have the lights on, and when we run out of candy, flip the lights off. It's supposed to tell the kids that you're out. Melvin's wife backs up the story, but that's kind of flimsy because just because a husband and wife's story match, that doesn't mean the police necessarily believe that. A wife could be covering for a husband. It's not a rock-solid alibi. So they check into Melvin's alibi, and it turns out that Melvin was employed at William Hobby Airport in nearby Houston. And the airport is able to confirm that not only was he at work, but due to his job as an air traffic controller, there were about 200 people who could confirm his alibi. They also confirmed that Melvin worked until late that evening, and him not arriving home until 11 p.m. matched with the appropriate amount of time for him to leave the airport and go home, according to these witnesses. So now the police go back to Ronald O'Brien and they say, hey, this can't be the guy. He's an air traffic controller. 200 people saw him. Rock solid alibi. No arguing. Wasn't Courtney Melvin. Ronald tells police he's pretty sure that that was the house, but again, it was a dark house and a hairy man's arm that thrust the candy at him and then shut the door.
So the police question Ronald again because they really want to try to get some kind of suspect. But they also question Ronald's story. They know that Ronald has no criminal history. He works as an optician, which is not an eye doctor. An optician is a technician who fits and dispenses glasses prescribed by the doctor. Police are concerned because Ronald's recollection on the home where he said he received the candy was less than precise. And like B told you, he had a hard time even picking out the street they were on, yet they only went on 2 streets in the neighborhood that night. They said Ronald was soft-spoken, but his emotions were not what people expected. They also learned that although Ronald was currently working as an optician, in the past 10 years, he had been through 21 jobs. He was also currently suspected of theft from his employer, Texas State Optical, so he was on the verge of being fired. He was also heavily in debt to the tune of about $100,000. Now, there were several reports that varied on his home. Some say it was in foreclosure, some say it had been foreclosed on, and others said that he had sold his home to pay off some of his debt. Either way, he was in danger of losing his home or had already sold his home. He was on the verge of losing his car and had defaulted on several other loans. They discovered that in January of that year, Ronald had taken out life insurance policies on both of his children. And then, 1 month before Halloween, he had taken out more life insurance policies on both of his children. The policies on his children totaled $60,000 for both of them.
True Crime Out Loud listeners know that is a massive red flag.
Yes, so now the police have a new suspect, and it is Ronald O'Brien. The insurance company tells the police that Ronald had called at 9 a.m. on November 1st, and we're talking only a few hours after his son's death. He called them inquiring about receiving the funds from the life insurance on Timothy. They also learned that the summer before Timothy's murder, Ronald had this customer at Texas State Optical who was also a chemical salesman. And this customer said Ronald had asked him about cyanide, to include how much it would take to be fatal to a human. The customer felt that this was just an odd topic of conversation. They found a witness who worked at a chemical outlet in Houston. This clerk had seen a man come in wearing a lab-type coat, which is what Ronald would wear as an optician, and he comes into the store and asks about purchasing cyanide. When he was told the minimum purchase amount was £5, he left. Now, this witness could not positively identify Ronald as the person, but said he fit the general description down to the lab coat he was wearing. But police were unable to find where Ronald would have purchased or could have purchased the cyanide. So the police also discover a adding machine tape. And these are these old school, it looks like a huge calculator, and you punch the numbers in and it prints out a little tape, right? So the tape had the numbers on it, and written beside it, Ronald had written the bill that number related to, and the total of it equaled to what he was going to get with his children's life insurance for both of them. But they confront Ronald with all of this evidence, and Ronald denies he did this and said he would not possibly do this to his child. He continued to maintain that some unknown person had poisoned and murdered his son. Police don't buy this, of course, and they arrest Ronald for the first-degree murder of his son and 4 counts of attempted murder.
Ronald O'Brien's trial began in May of 1975, and he was prosecuted by Mike Hinton. Deneen testified that she had absolutely no idea that Ronald was doing this or could have done it. The prosecution presented evidence discovered by the police that we've already mentioned to you. Ronald's sister-in-law testified that at Timothy's funeral, Ronald did something that disturbed her. Ronald was talking about using the life insurance money from Timothy's death to go on a long vacation. That's one of those things that is, people tend to do it. It always blows my mind how people get caught up in stuff like that. You would think if you murdered your kid, you would have enough self-control to not be talking like that at the funeral, but we see this kind of thing. The prosecution claimed that Ronald intended to kill Timothy and also intended to kill his 5-year-old daughter in order to collect on both life insurance policies. He was calculated in giving the candy to the other 3 children because that was done simply to keep suspicion off of him and make it look like some crazy person had given poison candy to trick-or-treaters. Ronald used the age-old fear of tainted candy, which he would have probably thought to be true and not just an urban legend, because let's face it, that's pretty much how everybody is, in order to kill these 5 kids. 2, to collect insurance policies, and 3, so that we have a good cover story. Police said people were scared, and they told parents if they saw any candy that was suspicious to bring it to the police. And so the police department ends up with a room full of candy as a result of this. Ronald is obviously found guilty on all counts and is sentenced to death. Deneen divorces Ronald immediately, and in 1979, Ronald appeals his death sentence, but it's upheld. In prison, he kind of takes on this moniker, kind of a macabre moniker. He was called the Candy Man by other inmates. Now, the Candy Man is officially the title of serial killer Dean Corll, who murdered in the Houston area, but because of the nature of the crime, he was called the Candy Man by other prisoners. In the media and among parents, he was known as the man who ruined Halloween. Ronald's execution came in 1984, 10 years after he murdered his own son with poison pixie sticks. His last meal was a steak with fries, peas, and Boston cream pie. As with any execution, there were crowds outside the prison on the night of the execution. Some were protesting the death penalty, and others were cheering for Ronald to be executed. Both sides of the argument waited for final word that Ronald had been put to death, and that was announced at 12:48 a.m., and he was executed by lethal injection. When he was pronounced deceased, the crowd actually cheered "trick or treat." And what's really crucial about this is the only known case in U.S. history where a child has died from poisoned Halloween candy. And it wasn't even given to him by a stranger, which is what we were told years and, for all those years, and what I was told by my parents. And then I recited to my kids. And I mean, who knows how long, and it's never actually happened that we can find a documented case of, except for this father who did it to his own child.
Before we get into the discussion, I want to tell something on myself. When my kids were little and would go trick-or-treating, I always would take candy and say, I don't think that looks safe, and I would take it and hide it and eat it later for myself.
Well, I don't remember that. I mean, I think I do remember my parents just kind of saying, hey, I'll have that and I'll have that. They wanted to get in on the action too. And
well, my kids luckily don't listen to this podcast.
And I also distinctly remember my parents physically looking at my candy. Checking over it. They'd take the bag when you walk in. Oh, don't attack it yet. They'd be digging through there. If you wanted to eat some while you were walking down the street, they would look at it to make sure. I mean, my parents did physically, check the candy. Of course, I came along kind of after apples were a thing. I don't remember getting any apples trick-or-treating, so I don't think they were real concerned about razor blades, but you certainly wasn't eating anything that was open or looked janky in any way.
Yeah, and my mom was the same way. She checked all the candy, but usually we only went to houses of people that we knew because we didn't want anything bad to happen. You didn't take anything that was prepared or baked, like those corn balls or brownies or anything like that. You couldn't eat that because you didn't know what was in them.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, and that's still a good practice because nowadays there's no telling what people might put in things.
Sure. And there could very well be cases where people have gotten tainted candy and it made them sick or something. Just, we don't know of any other case where a child has died from poisoned Halloween candy.
Yeah. So for the discussion, I want to get into kind of the urban legend. We were already talking about that and talking about how this tainted candy came around. I did see, and I'm sorry I don't have all the exact information, but this came about because of an article that came out in the newspaper, and I'm thinking it was maybe in the 50s or 60s, and it could have been as late as 1970, but an article came out about what if somebody poisoned our kids' candy or did something bad to the candy. And after the article came out, it kind of instilled that fear in parents. Oh my gosh, what if they did? So that's how it came about. But it's amazing how it has gone from generation to generation. I mean, 1974, I wasn't even born yet, but when I was a kid, it was still going on, and it still goes on now. And I will tell you, I didn't realize that this was the only case where a child has died until I started researching this podcast.
Oh,
or
sure.
this episode for the podcast.
Oh, sure. And I think that it latches on and kind of takes hold of you because it plays into that very base primal fear of all parents. You know, hey, something happening to their kid that they're not able to protect them from. And it kind of fits in with the theme of Halloween, right? It's not only is it, you know, kids dressed up, but I mean, let's face it, it's got a kind of a sketch past, you know, with some cultish overtones and that kind of thing. And I think that kind of plays into that, I don't know, fear or paranoia that there may be people out there on Halloween night that, you know, are not only out there to just have fun and maybe more than mischievous, that are just downright doing something evil.
So I just think it's a crazy case that this man is wanting to murder his children and stands to gain $60,000. I know that's a lot of money now, maybe not a whole lot, but 1974 it would have been. But both of your children for $60,000 to cover your debts, I mean, that's just unfathomable. I mean, like any case where people kill their own children, but I just can't get up my head around this one by giving them tainted candy. But again, 1974, no internet. We couldn't have Googled, hey, tainted candy or poison candy given to kids to see that this wasn't really going on.
Yeah, and I just think, I mean, the thing out of this is, for me, I mean, I'm glad that the child didn't realize that it was his father that gave it to him. You know, I mean,
oh yeah,
I don't know. That's just horrible because you're playing off the innocence of that child and the excitement. I remember so fondly, you know, my childhood and Halloween. And I mean, it was one of my favorites. What kid doesn't love Halloween, you know? And it's just, you can certainly feel that excitement that you felt when you were a kid. You know, you're going out and getting candy, and man, I loved pixie sticks too. I would have probably eaten a poison pixie stick. I mean, well, all kids would.
Yeah, because
They're
I mean,
very
they
popular.
don't know. Yeah. But I mean, and also his daughter had to grow up knowing my dad killed my brother and intended to kill me. So that's, I mean, it's just horrible all around. But to end this episode, we want to share our favorite Halloween with our kids. Now, this was only a few years ago, and we had our one daughter dressed up as a vampire, and the boy was dressed up as Monopoly Man.
Yeah, and it didn't go so good.
It was rainy. It was very, very rainy,
A
pouring down rain.
Yeah, a horrible night to go trick-or-treating. But we had set up this whole elaborate Monopoly Man costume. This wasn't one of those, you know, you buy it in a bag and put it on. We had bought everything, and he had the top hat, and he had the money, had a little money bag that had a dollar sign on. I mean, he looked the part. So much so that we got him a mustache, right? Everybody knows that Uncle Pennybags, or whatever the Monopoly Man's real name is, you know, he's got that big mustache. And something with that mustache wasn't gee-hawing with this kid. And I mean, he was crying, and this we captured the moment.
He was probably about 11 years old, and he was boo-hooing while I was trying to take pictures.
And he didn't want to wear the mustache. And we said, just wear the mustache for the picture, you know, because we want you to look like the Monopoly Man. And it sounds now like we were torturing our kids, but I will tell you, that was one of the absolute greatest pictures ever that we fully intend to play at his wedding. And we routinely show him that picture, and now he's up and driving around and isn't grown up, isn't concerned about Halloween candy at all. And he still to this day hates that picture, and it just makes me smile every time I see it. We did, in fact, go trick-or-treating. It was soaking wet and miserable, and he did it without the mustache.
And because both of the kids are teenagers and they are not the least bit interested in our podcast, I am going to post the Monopoly Man picture on our website. And if you're watching YouTube, you're seeing it now, and I can't help but laugh. And it makes me makes me feel good that we got to have those moments with our kids.
Yeah, it was certainly a picture for the ages. When you see the picture, just picture that picture being shown at every major family event for the rest of this kid's life, because it's coming. We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. As always, we'll see you next week, and happy Halloween. We would like to hear your thoughts on this and all of our cases, and as always, you can reach us by email at truecrimeoutloud@gmail.com, Facebook and Instagram at True Crime Out Loud. Out Loud is 2 words, not one, and Twitter at TC Out Loud.
Photos, links, and sources for this case can be found on our website at www.truecrimeoutloud.com.